It's a pleasure to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol. Here we are at the Darbar Hall of the Diggi Palace, Jaipur. Our session now is Interpreting Dharma, Bibek Debroy in conversation with Keerthik Sasidharan. This session is presented by the Rajasthan Patrika.
Thank you, Shoropa. Dr. Debroy, it's a great honor to be here and to be talking to you. I guess this is not a new topic for you by any means of imagination, by any stretch of imagination. What I did want to begin with, this idea of dharma is very sort of nebulous in some level, and is highly formalistic in some other concepts. I was just wondering if you can sort of introduce us to the idea as we see it today in 2021, when we look back into the past. How does one understand this in a very sort of high-level framework? And then we can get into more details later.
Thank you, Keerthik, and it's a delight to have this conversation with you. I think the most important introduction of all has been left out, which is that we are both columnists in Open Magazine, writing on very similar kinds of issues sometimes.
Yes.
Where I would like to start off with is this notion of precision. Different languages have different structures. And something that is precise in terms of one language, like English, may be imprecise in terms of another language, like Sanskrit. And most Indian languages are derived from this. Why am I saying this? The reason I'm saying this, if someone asked, what does the word Keerthik mean? In English, I would give some kind of meaning. Someone asks, what does the word Viveka mean? I would give some kind of answer in English. English and most Western languages have their basis on what nouns mean, what proper names mean, what pronouns mean. The basis of Sanskrit is completely different. The basis of Sanskrit is the verbal root, the dhatu. So whatever definition I give for Keerthik, Keerthik is based on the dhatu kri, which means to do. So the moment I hear the word Keerthik, I understand it is someone who is doing something. Vivek is not doing anything. Keerthik is necessarily doing something. Similarly, what does Vivek do? The verbal root, the dhatu for Vivek, is vichir, which means someone who discriminates. So anyone who's familiar with Sanskrit will immediately think that vichar and Vivek are very similar in meaning. So when we look at the word dharma, the moment we are trying to impose an alien language and trying to translate it into proper names, into nouns, because of our presumption, we will impart imprecision. What is dharma? Dharma is based on the verbal root to hold up. So anything that holds up, anything that holds up is dharma. Anything that holds up society, the fabric of society is dharma. Anything that holds up governance in a society is dharma. Anything that holds up individual behavior in terms of morality and ethics is dharma. So looked at it from the point of view of the root, the verbal root, actually it is very, very precise.
Excellent. So I guess to the point of precision versus sort of a natural nebulousness that comes from translation, one of the interesting things that at least I find is that when Europeans came and tried to understand this word, and they translate it into German or French or whatever, the number of sort of synonyms they have to rely upon is like, if for Gellner in German, for example, I think relies on like 140 potential synonyms in order to explain what is often simply called dharma in Sanskrit or rest of Indian languages. So one question or one thought I always had is that dharma often used as a noun? Is it a verb? Is it is it used as an instrumental case in Sanskrit? Or how is it generally used?
In a sense, it's all of these. And again, let me prove the same point. I hear the word ajagara. Now I look for translations in English and I say ajagara is a python, it's a boa constrictor, which of course it is. But if I look at it from a Sanskrit lens, ajagara is anything that swallows a goat. So if a crocodile comes along and swallows a goat, it's ajagara. If I have someone like Bhima who has a large enough appetite to eat up a goat, Bhima is also ajagara. This is the reason I am mentioning these differences in grammar, language, structures of languages, and therefore the word dharma in different contexts may mean completely different things. When I say moksha dharma, it is the dharma that leads to emancipation. It is the dharma that leads to freedom from existence in this particular world or samsara. But when I'm using the word dharma in terms of the three purusharthas, leaving aside moksha dharma, dharma, artha and kama, that's also dharma. So therefore, when one talks about Raja Dharma, one means the dharma of kings. When one means the dharma of varnas and ashramas, one means something else. One man is talking about the dharma for a householder. One means different things. So depending on the context, I can translate it as rule of law, morality, ethics, tasks, all of them.
Since you mentioned types or sort of typologies of dharma, so I guess most of us are in some sense householders in some sense, and both the Mahabharata and the Ramayana obviously engage quite extensively with what a householder must do or shouldn't do and so on. So how does Nitya, Naimittika, Kamya, etc. dharma for a householder, how does that fit in, I guess, not necessarily in modern context, but in generally, has it been understood?
I'm glad you are raising this question, because in the introduction, a reference was made to Hinduism. When one talks about texts on Hinduism, invariably one equates that with the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and all of that. All of which, and the Bhagavad Gita, all of which are about moksha dharma. And immediately one arrives at that conclusion that Hinduism was not interested in worldly pursuits, but was only interested in things that were otherworldly. But that is like someone going to an university today, picking up texts on engineering and saying that the students did not learn anything other than engineering. That's a sampling bias. And if I look at the series of translations that were brought out under the editorship of Max Muller, they focused on translating these. But these texts about moksha dharma were composed by people who were in vanaprastha and more typically in sannyasa. And in every society in the world, very few people are actually in vanaprastha and sannyasa. Amongst crores of people, only few will attain moksha. What did the rest of the individuals do? They did what householders do now as well as 2000, 3000 years ago. They hopefully earn artha by legitimate means, and they spend it on karma and dharma. Dharma not in the moksha dharma sense. That's the reason I think the Dharma Shastra texts and Itihas being defined as Rama and Mahabharata, and the Puranas, the 18 Mahapuranas are so very important because they're pertinent, much more pertinent for householders. And for householders, for example, Itihas Purana texts say that there are 5 Pancha Mahayagyas, 5 great sacrifices I must do every day. I must study, I must repay my debts actually, I must study, I must worship the gods, I must have offspring, and I must be hospitable towards humans, guests, and animals and birds. These were the 5 Pancha Mahayagyas. These were my Nitya Karma and daily Dharma. In addition, there were special rites of Dharma, Naimittika, which was for specific occasions, and there were specific rites of Dharma that I did to desire something in an attempt to get something back in return, and that was Kamya Dharma. So this was the template for the household.
Excellent. So maybe, because in the interest of time, maybe we can try to also briefly talk about how Dharma appears within, say, the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. Is it fair to say that there is I wouldn't say fundamentally different, but sort of an approach how to understand Dharma that is different in the Ramayana versus the Mahabharata?
I won't quite say that because I think the template is really the same.
Okay.
And across all the stories in our Itihas and Purana texts, we have this tension between 2 different calls of Dharma. Should I do this or should I do that? Both of which courses of action lead to consequences. So karma is the flip side of Dharma. And who is to say, because the progress of Dharma, because the nature of Dharma is so very mysterious, so very subtle, one never knows what is the right course of action. And this is the reason these stories and these accounts from the Ramayana, the Mahabharata and the Puranas appeal to us. Because the socio-economic context may be different, many other things may be different, but the dilemmas and the trade-offs and the consequent tensions that we face are no different from that time. That's the reason we identify with these. The structure of the Ramayana is simpler because it is Rama Ayana, it is Rama's progress. And therefore the Valmiki Ramayana, I'm talking about the Valmiki Ramayana, therefore the Valmiki Ramayana is fundamentally from Rama's perspective. The other protagonists are less important. They do figure, but you don't always necessarily get their points of view. Unlike that, the Mahabharata has multiple protagonists with multiple points of view, which is why it seems to be more complicated. Now, whenever people criticize Rama, as depicted in the Valmiki Ramayana, whether for the killing of Vali, whether for the killing of Shugriva, whether for the exile of Sita, whether for the Agni Pariksha, they forget that in each of these instances, Rama had a conflict of dharma also. People talk about Rama exiling Sita, forgetting that Rama also exiled his companion and brother of so many years, Lakshmana, at the drop of a hat. Again, because of that conflict of dharma. Now, the moment I have a conflict of dharma, who is to say that I am right and you are wrong? You can't. Which is why you do not have absolute commandments like thou shalt not lie or thou shalt not steal, because given a certain context, in the sense of overall welfare, it might be better to lie.
So that's a good point, because that nicely segues into this thought or question I had about this episode in the latter half of the Mahabharata, which is basically probably less popularly known, but is well known, I guess, in philosophy circles, is the one about where Arjuna gets into sort of into I shouldn't say a fight, but a sort of a contentious situation with Yudhishthira, and he basically says, because you insulted Gandiva, I have to, whoever insults Gandiva has to be assassinated. And then Krishna arrives at the situation and tells him two stories, and then in some sense resolves the crisis. So Krishna has a very, for lack of a better word, a poetic understanding of how to resolve these problems, while in some sense Rama has a more formalistic approach to dharma, but maybe because he has a certain other set of expectations behind him. Would you like to talk a bit more about that episode and how you think about it?
I would sort of, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I would state it a little bit differently.
Okay.
In the Valmiki Ramayana, Rama faced simpler situations. Rama never faced more complicated situations, and I could argue, that the incidents in the Ramayana happened in Treta Yuga, when everything was a little bit simpler. So even one is talking about Ravana. Ravana never crossed certain norms. In the text, according to the text, Dharma has 4 legs or 4 quarters in Satya Yuga, when people are naturally followers of Dharma. In Treta Yuga, it loses one of its legs or quarters. In Dwapara, it loses 2. And in Kali Yuga, it has only 1 left. So people deteriorate in terms of their inclinations towards Dharma as one goes down Satya Yuga, Krita Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga. In the Mahabharata, Krishna confronted, apart from as I said earlier, that the Mahabharata is a much more complicated text. In the Mahabharata, Krishna confronted many more circumstances which were much more complicated. And therefore, his reactions tend to be much more complicated. For Rama, everything was very simple. I have to abide by my pledge. Nothing else matters. His motives were very clear. I have to abide by my pledge, whether it is a pledge given to my father, whether it is a pledge given to Sugriv, whether it is a pledge given to the subjects of my kingdom. This is it. This is my pledge, and I shall not budge from it. Krishna's was much more complicated. Now, so far as that account is concerned, I'll give you a better instance, because I wanted to bring in the Dharma Forest also in some sense, or at least I wanted to bring in Bhishma.
Yes.
Bhishma, all of us know that he had a pledge of brahmacharya. And to keep the long story short, the princess of Kashi, Amba, said, if you do not marry me, I will immolate myself in the fire. And they figure out which dharma is more important for you, the dharma of protecting your vow of brahmacharya or the dharma of protecting a woman's life. So that was the conflict of dharma. And Bhishma decided the pledge of brahmacharya was more important. As a result of which, Amba immolated herself, became Shikhandi. We know the rest of it. What is sometimes not that well known is that Arjuna was also on a temporary vow of brahmacharya. Bhishma was permanent, Arjuna's was temporary. While he was observing that temporary vow of brahmacharya, the princess of the Nagas, Ulupi, fell in love with him and said, if you don't marry me, I will kill myself. And you have to decide which is more important for you, protecting your vow of brahmacharya or protecting a woman's life. So two Kshatriyas, both in identical situations of vows of brahmacharya, Bhishma decided the vow was more important. In Arjuna's case, Arjuna decided that protecting a woman's life was more important and married Ulupi. So this is just illustrative of the conflicts we have and how, given the same situation, two individuals might take two completely different decisions. And who's to say which is right and which is wrong? What one can say is we reap the consequences of our actions and decisions.
So Babruwahana is the son of
No.
Haravan is the son of Urlupi.
Yes.
Okay. So between, say, Krishna on one side and Rama on the other side, there is this sort of interesting persona of Yudhishthira in the middle, who on one side is, I mean, when I read the Mahabharata, I feel that he is in spirit at some level more akin to Rama, but at the same time he lives in the world of Krishna, so he has to do certain things in that. So is it fair to sort of place Yudhishthira as sort of this, not necessarily midpoint, but a sort of a transition figure in between these two archetypes?
I would be very hesitant to do that, and I'll tell you why. If you leave aside the Uttarkanda, the Valmiki Ramayana is compressed in terms of its narration. The story is simpler. In the Mahabharata, the reason I'm a bit hesitant to react to your statement is, as I have read and have reread the Mahabharata, I get the feeling Yudhishthira himself changes. The character of Yudhishthira's inclinations also change. The Yudhishthira of Adi Parva and Sabha Parva is not the same as the Yudhishthira of Vana Parva or Aranyak Parva. So it's almost as if Yudhishthira's character goes through a transformation. The Yudhishthira in Aranyak Parva and Vana Parva, I don't think would have gambled. And if one reads the Mahabharata very carefully, you will find a change in the way Draupadi regards Yudhishthira and addresses him. As one goes down sequentially and chronologically down the parvas of the Mahabharata, one tends to find that Draupadi treats him with much greater deference and respect. So that is the reason I would be a bit hesitant, because we are talking about you and I evolve. So just as you and I evolve over time, it seems to me that the character of Yudhishthira also evolved in the course of the Mahabharata.
So to slightly sort of a more sort of higher view is the question of how has Dharma been taught or propagated across generations in India. One of the stories, or one of the ways, is obviously these itihasas and Puranas, etc. But it seems the strategy of narration is very important. So it's like the Mahabharata is a story that Sauti tells, that he heard from Vaishampayana, that he eventually heard from that Vaishampayana heard from Vedavyasa, etc. So Dharma gets this sort of legitimacy by the fact that many different people have said similar or same things. Is that narrative structure very important for Dharma to gain legitimacy as a concept? Or
all right. You see, purely as a digression, it's not really pertinent for our purposes. There is the question of which one was composed first, the Valmiki Ramayana or the Mahabharata. I'm not talking about when those events took place, but which was composed first. I don't think, and composed as in not their original versions, but as in their final versions. Let us say we are talking about 500 CE roughly for the final versions, because there was an original version which was oral transmission, layers were added, then we had that final version, and let us say 500 CE. I don't think one can argue, as is popularly believed, that the final version of the Valmiki Rama was composed before the final version of the Mahabharata. I don't think one can argue that. For example, if I say, Na tvam shochitum arhasi, and ask where is this expression from, people will say it is from the Bhagavad Gita, ipso facto from the Mahabharata. However, this expression figures in the Valmiki Rama. The Ramayana, the Valmiki Ramayana is the story of Surya Vansha. The Mahabharata is the story of Chandravansha. In the Valmiki Ramayana, I have references to Yayati. Yayati is not Surya Vansha, Yayati is Chandravansha. Where is the story of Yayati? It's in the Mahabharata. So I think both of them drew on common traditions and common stories that used to float around. We come back to the notion of dharma. And I'm not using the word dharma now in the moksha dharma sense. Moksha dharma sense, obviously, there was a tradition. There was also a tradition in the 6 schools of philosophy that we had of Shada Darshana of what constitutes proof. And I wish more people explored the school of Nyaya, which describes to us the different kinds of proof. Among the different kinds of proof was this notion of what we have been told. Plus there were other methods of proof, but Shabda, what we have been told. So in the notion of dharma, remember the civil law tradition is of recent vintage, not pre-Napoleon. Its codification of law is of recent vintage. Laws used to be customary law. So much of dharma interpreted in that particular sense of what is law proceeded through precedents, which courts still follow. So some of these notions of dharma were because this has been the precedence.
Right.
This is Shabda, this is what we have been told.
Okay. So a slightly more sort of quote-unquote controversial topic is, for example, in the Mahabharata, occasionally even the narrator of an episode then provides his gloss on whom we may today consider God. For example, at some point Sanjaya describes the killing of Duryodhana and says it's sort of dharma chalam. So there's a certain kind of deception involved, or a certain transgression that took place. Is there a formal way of thinking about sort of deception, or what would generally be considered adharmic within the dharma context, or is that again very context specific and that's all we can say?
I think one needs to be a little bit careful. Because today we have a certain text. Some parts of the text may have been composed in 1500 BCE. Some parts may have been composed as late as 500 CE. And therefore, over a span of 1500 years, 1000 years, over a span of 1000 years, I will seemingly have inconsistencies. Inconsistencies including attitudes towards Krishna. And the notion of an avatar. It figures in some parts, it doesn't figure in other parts. I have someone like Shishupala contesting it. I have someone like Pondra Vasudeva,
the fake Vasudeva,
the same symbols as Krishna Vasudeva. So I have sections where Krishna was regarded as more human than in others, And I have sections where his status became much more elevated. The reason I said that we should be careful is today we cannot really sit down and identify the later sections from the earlier sections. And if I'm going to digress a bit from the Valmiki Ramayana, because that's easier, all kinds of people say, oh, Uttar Kanda is a later edition based on the present text. Maybe yes, maybe no. But who has said that the original Valmiki Ramayana had 7 kandas? That itself was a later edition. In other words, there are sections of Uttarkanda that may have been earlier. There may have been sections of Balakanda which may have been later. In exactly similar way, today if we sit down with the text, it's very difficult to disentangle. It becomes inherently subjective, not objective.
Right. When I was a young kid, my father used to tell me a shlokam about the Ramayana, which was I think composed in the 17th or 18th century, and it sort of is like says Shringaram Shritinandinim Viram Dhanur Bhanjane, etc. So basically, the entire Ramayana is reduced to 9 rasas of Ram from Rama, various reactions of Rama's life. Then the question comes: does the Mahabharata have a particular rasa, or can it only be solely considered as a dharma text? And then obviously Anandavardhana, etc., all these guys in 10th century or 9th century Kashmir say Shantarasa is the ultimate sort of archetypal emotion behind. How do you, as somebody who has translated this whole ocean of words, what do you get out of this? Like, what is the predominant feeling that you get? Or
that question has completely floored me. But if I were to react, I would say, well, it depends on whether one thinks there are 8 rasas or 9 rasas.
Right. Yeah.
Having said that, I think apart from Hasya rasa, which figures rarely, I think all the other rasas figure to a greater or a lesser extent somewhere or the other. And the nature of the rasa changes as we move along the epic. Obviously, this is not Vatsayan's Kama Sutra, so I should not expect Singar rasa in the sense that I expect it in Kalidas's Kumar Sambhav or Vatsayan's Kama Sutra. But otherwise, eventually it heads towards Shanta rasa, but not towards the earlier sections.
Okay. And I guess this is slightly more personal to you, because as a translator, is there a dharma for a translator? What do you think about that idea that a translator may have a very specific kind of dharma?
I think the dharma of a translator and is something that was once articulated many years ago, if I recollect correctly, by Chapman when he translated Homer. And in the introduction, Chapman said, my role as a translator is to translate exactly what Homer said. I do not get in the way. And I think that's a fundamental role of a translator, to be very careful to indicate when he or she is translating, and to indicate when he or she is interpreting. Sometimes the difference gets a little bit blurred. And therefore, it sometimes becomes difficult if you are translating from a language like Sanskrit to a language like English. And there are some words that I don't think can be satisfactorily translated. Dharma is one of them. Even Kshatriya, he would be extremely hesitant to do what Van Buitenen had done in his translation of the Mahabharata and call it barren, as in not B-A-R-R-E-N, B-A-R-O-N.
R-O-N, yeah.
So some words are very difficult to translate. But as I said, my intention, my dharma as a translator, I think, is to eliminate any distortions, any bits about the translator creeping in. If the translator creeps in through interpretations, that should be done through the footnotes, endnotes, not in the main body of the text. In the process, I should be candid and say that the English in the translations, not just the Mahabharata, all the other translations, is not as smooth as it might have been, because I wanted to be as honest towards the translation as is possible. And I can write better English, but that was not the intention. The intention was not to demonstrate my skills in writing English, but to translate as faithfully as is possible. So I think that's the Dharma.
Okay. I guess we're heading towards the last few minutes, but the canon of Indian thought has like innumerable number of epigrams, proverbs, sayings on dharma, etc. So one that I personally like is that says dharmasya tattvam nihitam guhayam. So basically, dharma, the secret of dharma is inside a cave in some sense. So that has a possibility of me going to discover it. It's hidden, so on and so forth. What do you have? I mean, it's a probably a superfluous question to ask you, but do you have something that you particularly find very resonant that about a saying about a dharma or a particular proverb or something that you find very interesting that keeps you engaged?
As I said earlier, I think dharma and karma are flip sides of the same thing. In the Bhagavad Gita, there's a part where Krishna tells Arjuna what is karma, what is akarma, what is vikarma. Even the wise men do not know, because you said dharma, I'm saying karma, because I regard the two as linked to one another. It is extremely difficult. I would not pick out one particular shloka, because there are so many where this refrain occurs, that the path of dharma is suksha, subtle. It is so very subtle and mysterious that it is impossible to figure out what is dharma.
On that very sort of agnostic note, I suppose, Dr. Debroy, thank you for this opportunity to talk to you. And when I could talk to you for like at least 2 hours more, and hopefully someday we will. But thank you for this opportunity, and thank you, Shorupa, and the people at the JLF for this. To me, a great, fascinating discussion, and I'll let you take it over, Shorupa.
Thank you, Bibek Debroy and Keerthik Sasidharan, for decoding the complexities of dharma and putting it in the contemporary context for all of us. That was truly enlightening. We thank Rajasthan Patrika for presenting the session. We thank our celebration partner Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience.